What in the heck is going on in South Korea these days?
A
And don't hold
lot.
back.
So a lot is happening. And I think it's important to place it inside a geopolitical context as well, because there's a lot happening in the world. Of course, Gaza, but also Syria. And then also, think about all the other strange political events that are happening. Bulgaria interfering in elections, in the government in Bulgaria, the attempted color revolution in Georgia, and then the election that was annulled in Romania, and then that weird election in France where the ruling party lost the election but decided to continue governing anyway. So, you have to understand South Korea inside that context of this kind of global collapse of this notion of pretensions towards democracy. And the reason why this is happening is because the Western imperial system, which is built up of subaltern states that are quote unquote supposedly democratic, but aren't really, because you can see when they get the wrong outcomes, they're very, very easily subverted. South Korea, is probably the prime example of that. South Korea, the president of South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol, on December 3rd, declared martial law. Okay, martial law means we are now a military dictatorship. The martial law plan said no political activity, no party activity, no assemblies, no gatherings. That is to say, literally, nobody is allowed to meet in a gathering. The only exception was religious gatherings. You can go to church, but any other assembly would have been illegal. All the media would have been controlled. All the functions of the National Assembly would have been suspended. In other words, martial law is like saying you have been inducted into the military and you do what the military tells you to do. It's a kind of total control over, your every action. So Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law at 10:25 in the evening, just as people were, going to bed and, putting on their pajamas. And and then thousands of people, Koreans, rushed out onto the streets and they, got to the National Assembly. And 200 National Assembly members, these are the Korean Congress people, 200 National Assembly members, 190 National Assembly members were able to make their way to the National Assembly and rescind the martial law. Okay. Now, the Korean constitution allows for the president to declare martial law, but it also allows for the National Assembly to rescind martial law. And what Yoon Suk-yeol, the president, had done is he had sent paratroopers and police to surround the National Assembly and to prevent the National Assembly members from voting down martial law. It's come out in the weeks since the martial law was actually declared, was that these plans were much, much more nefarious and violent than we had thought. People said, oh, he just did it out of, a fit of, madness, a fit of passion. No, apparently this was planned for months, possibly 18 months in advance. Certainly by March and April of this year, there was very, very explicit rehearsal and planning that was set up. There'd been one martial law command with 3 martial law commands with 25 subcommands that had already been structured. When they sent in the paratroopers, 107 military vehicles, 12 Black Hawk helicopters, 1,500 troops, 9,000 rounds of ammunition, I mean, this was something that was planning, this is a very serious, military intervention, could have resulted in mass bloodshed. Apparently, there was a delay, and the paratroopers were not able to get to the National Assembly fast enough. These special warfare forces, they're like SEAL team or something like that. They were not able to get there fast enough. The National Assembly members were actually able to get there before the troops were able to get there. And this is, people like you and I, not young people, people in their 60s, jumping over the fences, and then, rushing inside and then barricading the National Assembly. It looks like something out of Les Mis, it looks like the Paris Commune. It's like Train to Busan. They're barricading the doors with mountains of furniture just to delay the troops from getting in. And we know now that Yoon Suk-yeol was calling the martial law command throughout the night, telling them to drag out the National Assembly members, prevent them from getting quorum, prevent them from voting, shoot them if you have to, but get them out, prevent that. And if we need to, even if they rescind, we will declare martial law again and again. And it's come out that, there were teams, kidnapped teams that were dispatched to detain and spirit away key opposition leaders to black sites. There was also a plan to spirit away the leader of his own party, Han Dong-un, to this black site. There were plans to go to the Central Election Committee and do something to the servers. It's not quite clear what they plan to do, but there were troops sent to to the Central Election Committee, and so it's extraordinary. They were planning to, disrupt and shut down the National Assembly. They're planning to kidnap the top opposition leaders, and they were planning to, shut down or interfere somehow in the Central Election Committee. But now more information has come out. Early on, there were reports, these were hearsay reports, that there had been plans to trigger a war with North Korea and to use war with North Korea as the pretext for martial law. It turns out that these attempts may have actually happened because there was a notebook by a man, No Sang-won, his former defense security chief, defense counterintelligence command chief, and they found a notebook. He was apparently one of the coup plotters, and apparently he was, a shaman as well. And they met at a hamburger joint to plan the coup. So, the ridiculousness is getting off the charts. But they found a notebook in which he talked about provoking a war with North Korea along the northern limit line. This is the maritime sea boundary, which is contested and which in the past has caused a direct kinetic fire between North Korea and South Korea. So we see now that there were multiple attempts to provoke North Korea into a kinetic exchange over the northern limit line in June, in September, and in November 27th. There were massive live fire exercises along the northern limit line using HIMARS type missile launchers, firing 900 rockets. I mean, this is the kind of stuff which is, it's extraordinary. And it is extraordinary that North Korea did not respond with live fire on its own, as a reaction to this.
Do we know why?
And we think that North Korea was simply just buckling down, and it anticipated war, but it was not going to give South Korea the pretense or the satisfaction. So
how likely is it that all this was happening and CIA knew nothing about it?
Well, that is the $64,000 question, right? Right? That is the $64,000 question.
Right.
Because first, there is no military that is as tightly integrated with the US military as the South Korean military. They literally report to a US general, right? There is the CFC, UNC, USFK Joint Command. That is a four-star general, US general. And the entire South Korean military structure reports to this general, who reports to Indo-PACOM and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then to the President of the United States. South Korea's military is really an appendage of the US military. And the US has OPCON over South Korea's military in times of war. So if a war had been triggered, immediately the US would have gotten control over South Korea's 500,000 troops, plus potentially another 3.1 million reserve troops. So could the US have known? I would say, rather, I would ask the question, is it even conceivable that the US could not have known about this?
Right.
I think that's the question that needs to be asked. But let's go back to, what the US knew and when it knew it. Certainly, the US knows everything that goes on on the peninsula. Certainly, everything military that happens on the Korean Peninsula has to be coordinated and communicated with the US. Why? Because there are 28,000 US troops, 60 bases. That entire region is packed full of troops and weaponry and radar and hair trigger response systems. You cannot have, 20, you cannot have 12 Black Hawk helicopters fly over the central Seoul without the US knowing about it, right? All of this has to be communicated. And then the other thing I think, which is, very, I think, again, is circumstantial, but the US has always been involved in past coups. Every coup that has happened in the past has been green-lighted by the US. And then the third piece of it is look at the response of the US as the coup was happening. It was a self-coup. Martial law declaration was a self-coup. But as it was happening, what was the response of the United States? There's nothing, right? Instead of denouncing, quote unquote, South Korea is this model democracy, it's the teacher's pet of US imperialism. And instead of denouncing South Korea for suddenly turning into a military dictatorship, the US says, we continue to observe events carefully, right? We continue to observe events carefully, and South Korea and the US have an ironclad alliance. That's the mantra. And Vedant Patel, the State Department spokesperson, was asked the question, by a journalist, do you condemn the coup? And he just hemmed and hawed and, squirmed and essentially said, I'm not a, expert on South Korean constitutional law, And then, they asked him, well, then do you support the rescission of martial law, because the National Assembly has rescinded martial law? And again, he said, well, we can't get ahead of ourselves, refuses to condemn martial law and refuses to support the rescission of martial law. Okay, very, very interesting comments. And then Jake Sullivan was asked, were you surprised that Yoon Suk-yeol declared martial law? And instead of saying, I was shocked, I was surprised, I wasn't in the know, he says something very curious. He says, I don't think anybody anticipated that martial law would have been declared and rescinded. Why did you add that second part there, right? Is that what you were surprised? Nobody could have foreseen that. So there are some very, very, kind of interesting statements, to say the least, from the US leadership. But we have to understand, again, in the larger context, that Yoon Suk-yeol was Washington's man in Seoul. He was the leader that they wanted. And the reason why they wanted him was he was going to be the spear point of war against China. Remember, the US is escalating to war against China. And one of the most important staging grounds, staging zone for war against China is the Korean Peninsula. It is literally the on-ramp onto the continent. And traditionally, for 600 years, all seaborne attacks against China have happened from Korea and Taiwan, usually both at the same time. And so they need Korea as a staging zone, as a place from which to launch war. And Yoon was the perfect candidate for that, because not only was he going along with everything Washington wanted, he was a walking fulfillment list, if you will. I mean, when Yoon was elected, the champagne corks burst in Washington. And he, more than any other leader, brought Korea and Japan and the US into a trilateral military alliance, something which would have been unthinkable for Koreans prior to Yoon Suk-yeol. It's just not conceivable that South Korea would enter into a military alliance with its former colonizer. The rising sun in South Korea, is like the Nazi Hakenkreuz.
Sure.
It's something which is inconceivable. And the fact that Yoon Suk-yeol was forced this kind of marriage, this shotgun marriage onto Koreans and the Korean military is astonishing. And it's one of the reasons why he was so extremely unpopular. And one of the reasons why people were seeking to impeach him. And it was actually one of the formal clauses in the impeachment that he had had an imbalanced and hostile foreign policy towards China and North Korea, and that he had filled his government with Japanese collaborators and sympathizers. That was actually one of the impeachment clauses that was proposed in the first impeachment. So anyway, Yoon Suk-yeol was Washington's man. He was Washington's walking wish fulfillment list. And now that he is radioactive, Washington is very, very unhappy, and they're going to put more pressure on South Korea to see if they can keep them on the straight and narrow, make sure that they do not, go off, quote unquote, the reservation.
So
what's the public doing?
say it
I
again,
don't
Harvey.
hear about it if there were huge demonstrations, but are there?
Huge demonstrations. I mean, just I don't know if this is being covered, but yesterday, Saturday, there were 500,000 people in the streets of Seoul alone. 500,000. If you think of the Washington, the 19 the march to the Washington Memorial with
Yeah.
Martin Luther King, that was 250,000 people.
Hmm.
That's twice the size of that march. And they were all waving light sticks, because that's how they're protesting these days. But extraordinary numbers, extraordinary passion, and very little coverage in the Western press. And part of it has to do with the fact that the US and the Western press generally only cover protests when the people are holding signs that are written in English, right? These are all Korean signs, which means that it's a grassroots, really.
Yeah.
It's a grassroots protest. And there's an extraordinary groundswell of outrage against Yoon Suk-yeol. Martial law in South Korea means, it's been declared 12 times before it, it means arbitrary arrests, it means torture, it means arbitrary murders, uh, incarceration, disappearance, mass murder, genocide. That's what martial law means. And when Koreans heard that Yoon Suk-yeol had declared martial law, this is why people rushed out in the night in their pajamas. I mean, you can see, there's a 30-year-old lawmaker, or I think she's a spokesperson for the opposition party. She's tussling with a special forces soldier, who has an assault rifle trained on her. There was a blind legislator, and she rushed out in the middle of the night, and she herself tried to scale the obstacles in order to get into the National Assembly to vote. Because she was blind, she wasn't able to. But she says that in my heart, I pressed that button opposing martial law 1,000,000 times in my heart. Can you imagine somebody, blind, rushing through the dark, trying to get past, hundreds of troops and trying to scale a wall, at night? We also know that there were parents who called their children, who were in the military, and said, whatever you do, you cannot hurt civilians.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
it was a kind of huge civic response. And I think this is what, helped South Korea dodge the bullet. But certainly, people are outraged, and they're out in the streets in force. The West is trying to portray this as, something all light and fun, and, this is some kind of big party event, if they cover it at all. But everybody knows what the stakes are. Koreans have seen this over and over and over again. They overthrow a dictator, the US puts in another one. They overthrow a dictator, US puts in another one, over and over again. This is the pattern in Korean society. And Yoon is his party, and Yoon is the comprador, US client. And I think the US would be very, very fine. They would be fine to have Yoon as a dictator, because Yoon is the dictator, and the US has operational control. And then, my goodness, what a interesting opportunity for us to horizontally expand against North Korea, which has signed a mutual defense treaty with Russia, and to escalate and to continue escalation to war against China. And so I don't think it's a coincidence that we're seeing all of these things happening, all of these political events happening all over the world. And I think Korea is one of the places where, and we're not out of the woods yet. It is still a very, very dangerous, precarious situation. We just had to, not only did we impeach the president, but we impeached the prime minister, who was the caretaker president. We impeached him for stonewalling the process, because he was refusing to appoint the judges to the constitutional court that would render the final judgment on the impeachment. And so we're not out of the woods yet. There are lots and lots of twists and turns. Yoon is refusing any summons. He's refusing service of documents that he has been impeached and that he has to testify. He's refusing any search, any warrants, and he's just holding out. He's kind of locked himself into the presidential compound with the presidential security detail, which is like a small army. He's just holding out. And in the meantime, we see all kinds of, pressure and subterfuge being imposed on the South Korean process. And at the same time, you have, mass uprising, millions of people out in the streets speaking out and trying to make sure that we get rid of this time, that we get rid of these, dictatorial monsters, this time around. I mean, it's been so many times Koreans have had to do this. 1948, Syngman Rhee, 1961, Park Chung-hee, 1979, 1980, Chun Doo-hwan, 1987, Roh Tae-woo, etc. We just get this stream of dictators. Each time they're overthrown, we get another one. And so I think Koreans are sick and tired of this. And they're out in the streets en masse because they want to make sure that this is once done for once and for all.
Do you think they can? Or do you think, I mean, I'm thinking all the crowds in the streets and the crowds in Ukraine were manipulated to throw away the freely elected guy, I forget his name, and install somebody before Zelensky, but the pro West. So I just worry, can the people actually get it done, or is the United States going to install somebody new, or is Yoon going to survive this?
Those are really good questions, and I don't have the answer. I can only say there'll be more twists and turns, and the stakes are incredibly high because the U.S. Hegemony, global hegemony, to a certain extent pivots on what happens in Korea. Most people don't know this, but the United States, as a permanent national security state, started with Korea. Prior to that, it didn't have this permanent national security state structure. It was after Korea that it became a permanent national security state, and with a global empire, with global reach. That really started in Korea. And so, is there the kind of, is there a chiastic story where, it also ends in Korea? We don't know, but the stakes are extremely high, and certainly the pressure is intense. And certainly this is the reason why Yoon Suk-yeol, who otherwise is a person who had no qualification to becoming the leader of a country, became the president of South Korea. He was Washington's man. They wanted him. And he gave them everything that they wanted. His quote unquote South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy was a clone of the US Indo-Pacific strategy, essentially escalate to war against China using a military alliance with Japan, and just essentially preparing for South Korea to be Ukrainized in war against China. So will they let go of that? They won't. This is the message that the US is constantly putting out. They're saying our alliance with South Korea is ironclad. And that's an interesting, military metaphor right there. But essentially they're saying, you don't get any ideas. Don't think that you can change what we have planned out, because we've been planning this out for, 15 years now, right? So I think it's going to be a hard lift. Is it possible that Yoon could stay in power? It's not impossible. He is being impeached, but the impeachment has to be judged by the South Korean Constitutional Court. He needs 6 out of the 9 justices have to uphold the impeachment, but there are only 6 justices sitting on the court right now. And there were 3 more in the wings waiting to be appointed, but the caretaker president, Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, refused to appoint them. And so this was clearly, an attempt to stonewall the impeachment, which is why he himself was impeached. And Han Duck-soo, again, was somebody that the US was very approving of. And now we have the third in command. This is Choi Sang-mok. He's the Minister of Finance, and he is currently the caretaker president right now. Will he appoint, or will he stonewall again? That remains to be seen. So the path towards impeachment is not clear. there's also a parallel prosecution or indictment which is being prepared for Yoon Suk-yeol for insurrection. Okay, Yoon Suk-yeol is considered not simply by declaring martial law in the way that he did, this is considered an act of insurrection. And there are three different investigative organizations, the police, the prosecutor's office, and the CIO, which are all investigating him. But Yoon has stonewalled all of their subpoenas, all of their demands for documents, all of their summons, and he essentially is ignoring all of them. So, what gives him the strength to think that he can resist this? It's very curious, but I think it's because he believes that the same people who put him into power may want him to remain in power. I don't know if he's correct in that judgment, but clearly there are powerful forces that are holding and supporting him. So will he get impeached? It's unclear. Will he be prosecuted? It is still unclear. And the prime minister, the acting president, has refused to appoint a special prosecutor. Well, actually, in the National Assembly, they keep shooting down the proposal to have an independent counsel, which is really what you need. You need an independent counsel to investigate the president for sedition. And that is being constantly shut down. So you can see the opposition party is constantly shutting them down.
Mhm.
Now, you made the analogy towards Ukraine. Something you have to notice, you have millions of people out on the streets, and you can tell if a protest is a pro-US instigated event or if it's a grassroots event, okay? What's the first thing that you can see? What's the
Eng-
first indication?
English.
Exactly. If you see people with thousands of English signs, then you know that they're, performatively performing for the Western press, right? So that's the first indication. You will not see a single English sign anywhere in all of these, millions of protesters. Nobody's protesting for a Western audience. They're protesting because they want to reclaim their country from military dictatorship. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that, yes, there are counter-protesters. There are counter-protesters. They're a tiny, tiny fraction of the people who want impeachment. And do you know what you see with those counter-protesters?
They get
Um,
interviewed in English.
Uh, you
MAGA
see
hats,
American flags. They're
American flags.
waving American flags.
Yeah.
Okay? So they have South Korean flags and American flags, and they're waving them together. And apparently, what has been happening is that they're I guess, reactionaries who support Yoon Suk-yeol, and they're putting out, messages and saying, report anybody who is demanding impeachment, report them to the CIA. Okay, and
Ah,
they, share the US, CIA website, report them to the CIA because, they are, opposing US strategy. So I think that tells you how that, political divide is falling. But essentially, this is what a grassroots, protest looks like. There's nothing, I think, which is more obvious than that. It's very, very organic. It's people rising up, speaking, and coming together of their own volition. It is opposed to US hegemony. It is opposed to the interests of US hegemony. It is opposed to the client of US interests in the United States. And the US is trying to figure out, navigate how it is going to deal with this. Because if it comes out strongly in favor of Yoon, then very quickly those protests are going to turn anti-American. I think they're right on the cusp
mhm.
of that. The US doesn't want that. Right now they're, just, trying to see if they can hold the fort, see if they can still maintain policy and maintain influence over Korea. But they don't want to do it too overtly, because the moment they do, it will immediately turn anti-American. And we've seen multiple, historical, moments where that has happened as well.
Yeah.
Do you see this escalating? Do you see this? I mean, do you see violence in the streets? Do because I think here we have this
Mhm.
idea that, okay, the Koreans will protest and they'll negotiate, then they'll sit down and talk because they're sane. They're, they're more rational than other places we've seen. But this sounds like it could tip into something that's uh, I don't know whether I would want to go Syria-esque or Libya-esque, but that drastic. But this sounds like it's on the edge of trouble.
You know, I'm hypothesizing here, but this could very easily have turned into a Syria type situation. I don't put that out of, the realm of possibilities. And the reason why I say that is that, remember, there is very, very clear evidence which seems to suggest that this was an attempt not simply to declare a coup, but to trigger a war with North Korea. Okay, we're seeing more and more evidence. We see, all the incursions, all the, provocations along the northern limit line, which apparently seem to have been planned out as part of the martial law declaration. Just recently, a company has said that they received a commission to make North Korean military uniforms and deliver them to the South Korean Defense Intelligence Command. Why would you be making 170 North Korean military uniforms, right? So
Right.
this gives more credence to the, so far unsubstantiated allegations that, there were clearly attempts to kill off opposition leaders and to blame it on a North Korean attack, that it was going to be a false flag attack that would be attributed to North Korea. So there are all kinds of evidence that seems to be surfacing. And so this could have tipped over into war. And again, as I point out, when South Korea is in war, the US has control over South Korean troops. Okay, so this could have escalated into very, very, dangerous territory very rapidly. We know that the US has been planning a war against China and against North Korea for, at this point, years now. Last year, there were 200 days of military exercises. That's the South Korean military rehearsing almost every other day with the US military, some kind of major military exercise. So this was ongoing all the time. There were 20 strategic exercises, nuclear exercises that happened last year, and more to come. And so I think that, when we talk about the possibility of violence or war, we know that that was actually planned, that there was a plan in this martial law uh, declaration to trigger war. So that much is also clear. Now, on the other hand, what would this have looked like in the streets? On the one hand, you can see that there was preparation for mass violence. 9,000, you don't take 9,000 rounds to the National Assembly unless, there's some, essentially plan to use them. But at the same time, it seems there have been countervailing factors. For example, the special warfare troops were 48 minutes late arriving to the National Assembly. Why? Because they were trying to go through a very tight air security corridor and they didn't receive permission, or the permission was delayed. And so they were 48 minutes late. The National Assembly members got there before them. We know that there are parents that were calling their children who were in the military, telling them, you cannot fire on civilians. And so there were these countervailing messages. And then, the troops that were sent to the National Election Commission, apparently, they were supposed to rush there as fast as they could, but they actually slowed down and they stopped over at a convenience store and had, bowls of ramen noodles, before leisurely sauntering over to the National Election Commission. So there was some kind of, passive resistance or minimal compliance that was also happening. And that has to do with the fact that Yoon Suk-yeol is not a military man. He's actually a draft dodger. In the past, military coups have always been instigated by generals. And in the case of Yoon, I think he took on those airs, took on those presumptions. But for the vast majority of conscripts in the South Korean military, they know that he's a draft dodger. And, in a country where everybody's conscripted, the conscripts are not going to take orders from a draft dodger. There's just some fundamental, disconnect that happens there. So I think it could go either way. There could be more violence. This could have become a very, very serious bloodbath. It could have actually been the trigger to war that I have been warning against, and that, that all this escalation seemed to suggest. And I'm sure there will be more twists and turns. Nobody knows the end of this story yet. But at the same time, as I point out, there's mass opposition, millions of people who are outraged and passionate, and they want to make sure that they do not go back 45 years to the period of military dictatorship. And of course, there are contradictions, and there is a certain level of, I think, lack of compliance in the military, I think, which is actually very, very salutary. So we'll see, Jim, right now, it's a big unknown.
Okay. Well,
If you can remind us where we can find your commentaries on this crisis as it evolves, where your pieces are published.
Yeah, there are a couple of pieces that are published on pearls and irritations, and also counterpunch, and essentially it's a legitimation crisis in South Korea, and so those people can look up those articles if they want to read. There's some other interviews that I've done. I think there's a fairly extensive interview that I did with Jeff Rich on the Burning Archive about a crisis in Korea.
all right, KJ.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, and please stay close. We'll be back in touch pretty quickly, I'm sure.
Will do.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. We'll let you go.